Russia-Ukraine news. Russia attempts to win in Ukraine by opening an African front. Coup d'états influenced by global power struggles between the United States and the Soviet Union have shaped Africa's history. Putin's efforts to revive its former USSR foreign policy tactics were on display at the Russia-African Summit held on July 27–28, 2023. The situation in Niger, coupled with the familiarity engendered by the neo-colonialist struggle speeches in St. Petersburg, is evocative of the unsettling sensation of watching a classic film, albeit one with real-life consequences. The recent coup in Niger, supported by Burkina Faso and Mali, has increased the risk of a major African war. Similar to the Cold War era, the continent is becoming a stage for power confrontations between major nations. Russia, unable to directly challenge the West, appears to be using KGB-style hybrid methods to undermine US and French interests in Africa via proxy forces. Colonialism, national liberation movements, dictators, and feeble democratic leaders are all back on the table at the summit, bringing with them Cold War rhetoric from the 1970s. Russia appears to be increasing its presence on the continent, and is doing so in part by promoting anti-colonialist narratives. Russia appears to be taking advantage of the instability in Africa to advance neocolonialism, using the instability to consolidate its power in a number of countries. Africa's allure is understandable given the continent's untapped human resources and enormous, unrealized buying power. Both the West and China have seen the potential in this and are making investments in production and education to take advantage of it. Russia, on the other hand, seems intent on contributing to the destruction of production and the well-being of people by supplying weapons to dictators. In exchange, it can exploit Africa's mineral wealth for profit. This is consistent with a canonical example of neocolonialism from the decade of the 1960s. However, China has taken a different path and is not following this model. It is still influenced by its colonial past. Investments should be made in both production and human capital, including education, to promote positive development in Africa. When compared to the strategies used by the West and China, the neo-colonial approach that Russian experts and politicians advocate when discussing the West is seen as ineffective. After his blitzkrieg attempt to conquer Ukraine in 2022 failed, Putin looked to China to forge an alliance against the West. This strategy, however, was unsuccessful, and so Putin shifted his focus to the continent of Africa. African lions have abundant resources of their own and primarily require financial and military support, in contrast to the Asian tigers, led by China, who express interest in Russian energy resources. Nonetheless, China is able to swiftly and effectively meet the financial and competency requirements of African countries because it is not constrained by sanctions. Withdrawal from the grain deal, and the quasi-mutiny of June 24, significantly weakened Russia's competitive advantages in supplying food and power resources through entities like the Wagner Group, to counter Chinese influence in Africa. Putin announced $90 million in future financial aid to African countries and decided to forgive about $23 billion in debt owed by African countries as a means to achieve his goals at the summit. If Russia did not revive the Black Sea grain deal, he offered to give away grain to African nations for free. Rather than accepting Russia's free grain offer, African countries have made political demands for an end to the war in Ukraine based on principles of justice and reason, and have insisted on the resumption of the Black Sea deal. A survey conducted by Afrobarometer found that China is Africa's most desired economic partner, followed by the United States. Surprisingly, Russia has an even lower approval rating in Africa than the countries that once dominated the continent as colonial powers. Russia's trade with Africa is only $18 billion, compared to $282 billion with China and slightly more than $72 billion with the United States. Putin, seemingly out of economic and political arguments, is reverting to Wagner Group tactics in an effort to sow discord and instability across Africa. And Yevgeny Prigozhin showed up to the summit for the first time since his failed mutiny. Putin faces formidable obstacles in his efforts to establish Russia as a major player in Africa due to China's dominance and the absence of compelling economic and political incentives. Russia is now cornered and it is unclear how successful their tactics will be in the African setting. Compared to the first Russia-African summit in 2019, which was attended by 49 delegations, the 2023 summit was attended by only 17 heads of state. Putin, in spite of dwindling political support, has vowed to further Russia's ties with Africa. However, it appears that Russia is using mercenary groups and arms supply to establish zones of influence in the volatile region as part of this integration. Putin prefers to fight for Africa by bribing the armed forces of uncontrolled states, as evidenced by the recent coup in Niger. This indicates that the Kremlin will likely keep employing the Wagner mercenary group to carry out coups d'état, though it will likely supplement their efforts by hiring a number of other private armies to act on Russia's behalf as well. There is evidence that the Kremlin intends to use a strategy of self-reproduction of terrorists in Russia-friendly African countries, building on its long history of exploiting such groups. Terrorists will be resold to private military companies and then used in civil wars across Africa. Terrorism's underlying issues, such as cultural and legal vacuums, extreme poverty, easy access to weapons, and a lack of opportunities for upward mobility, seem to be of little interest to the Kremlin. Rather, it sees terrorism as a means of influence, which has led some to worry that Russia is increasingly becoming a terrorist state. The recent coup in Niger appears to be Putin's first strike, as its implications extend beyond the region and may have far-reaching effects on the geopolitical scene. It appears that Russia is either directly involved in or is providing funding for this coup in an effort to set up proxy zones under their control and start a major war in Africa. Coup leaders notably switched allegiance symbols from the French tricolor to the Russian tricolor and chanted pro-Putin slogans. France, a key EU state, risks losing its leverage over energy control if Niger does not return to Western control, so this is a major concern from a security perspective. The Russian Federation and the new military regime are currently receiving this leverage. There may be far-reaching consequences for the region's and world's geopolitical situation due to the military coup in Niger. If the coup leaders stay in power and legally elected President M. Bazoum is deposed, and if Niger aligns itself with Russia, France may be forced out of the Sahel zone, and Russian influence in the region may serve as a buffer between the Arab North and Black Africa. In addition, this could be a major setback for nuclear power in France and Europe, casting doubt on Emmanuel Macron's legacy as president who let his country be sidelined from its own national interests. Russia has intentionally stoked this crisis in order to draw attention and aid from the global West, away from Ukraine and toward an African front. Russia's strategy appears to involve employing private armies and proxy forces in the region to advance its aims. It seems that the Wagner Group was not directly involved in the coup. However, after the Russia-Africa summit, there have been hints that Wagner is enlisting supporters for an African campaign. There appears to be a massive recruitment drive indicated by the announcement, which calls for 500 volunteers to travel to Libya. Wagner Group instructors have relocated to Niger from Mali, guaranteeing armed conflict in the near future. The crisis in Niger is more important than ever in light of these new developments, which may alter the regional and even global geopolitical landscape. The international community needs to keep an eye on the situation in Niger to learn how major power struggles may affect regional and global stability. Russia's recent reorientation toward Africa, after previous failed attempts at an eastward orientation, places it in an advantageous position as a resource base for larger economies and an economic substrate for smaller ones. Since the Kremlin has been unable to regain the Western market, especially in energy resources, the impression has been created that Russia is abandoning the African region, all the while trying to portray this as a fight against colonialism, despite the fact that it has become a colony of Beijing. Putin's actions, then, are indicative of Russia's decline from global power to regional African-Asian laggard, with the country attempting to play both the role of metropolis and colony. Russia's long-term global positioning and its ambitions for influence in the international arena are called into question by this change.